Hi, Grandma here. I'm reading chapter 3 of our book, A Long Way from Chicago, and it's called A One-Woman Crime Wave. We have talked about various ways to increase your reading comprehension, and today we're going to talk about prediction. So, if the name of the title is One Woman Crime Wave, who do you think that one woman is? 1931. Now remember, we had a problem with the beginning of chapter 2, which was, wow, this is not like other books. The first chapter was 1929, the second chapter 1930, and this one's 1931. And if you remember, the reason for this is the children live in Chicago, but they go down and visit their grandmother every summer. And each story tells of an adventure they had for that summer. So 1931. A Great Depression has swept over the nation, and we couldn't seem to throw it off. It was still hoovering over us, as people said. Hoovering is a word that we don't use much anymore. It's like a vacuum cleaner or sweeping over us. It hadn't bottomed out yet, but it was heading that way. You could see hard times from the window of the Wabash Bluebird, a train. The freight trains on the siding were loaded down with men trying to get from one part of the country to another, looking for work and something to eat. Mary Alice and I watched them as they stood in the open doors of the freight cars. They were walking along the right-of-way, too, with nothing in their hands. Then when we got off the train at Grandma's, a news sign on the platform read, "Drifters keep moving. This means you." Signed, O.B. Dickerson, Sheriff. But at Grandma's house it seemed to be business as usual. Mary Alice was still skittish about the old snaggletooth tomcat in the cob house. Grandma said if he worried her that much, she ought to use the chamber pot in place of the privy. Chamber pots were under the bed, and they were handy at night, but Mary Alice couldn't use hers during the day. She didn't want to climb the stairs just for that, and she didn't want to have to empty it any more than necessary. Being 9, Mary Alice decided to take charge. She carried a broom to the privy to swat the cat if it gave her any trouble. She was soon back that afternoon, dragging the broom. Her eyes were watering and she was holding her nose. "Something died in the cob house," she said. "Naw," Grandma said, "it's cheese." "I don't want any," Mary Alice said. "Well, it's not for you," Grandma said. Now that they mentioned it, I could smell something pretty powerful wafting into the kitchen, and I could see the old tomcat from here stretched out in the yard. He was breathing hard and nowhere near that cob house. The cheese smelled bad enough to gas a cat, but it was no use asking what it was for. We were bound to find out. Grandma's house was the last one in town. Next to the row of gladiolas was a woven wire fence, and on the other side of that a cornfield. On the first nights, I'd always lie up in the bed, listening to the husky whisper of the dry August corn in the fields. Then on the second night, I wouldn't hear anything. But this year came the sound of shuffling boots, and sometimes a voice. The Wabash Tracks that cut the town in two ran along the other side of the road. The sheriff's deputies were out, carrying shotguns, moving the drifters along, so they didn't hang around town to beg for food. From my window, I watched the swaying lanterns, and ahead of them the slumping figures of the drifters heading for the next town. It was kind of spooky and sad. The drifters are men that have no jobs, no money, no food, and they are traveling along the railroad tracks trying to find food and jobs. But it was a short night. At 5 the next morning, Grandma was at the foot of the stairs, banging a spoon against a pan. When we got down to the kitchen, we found her in a pair of men's overalls, stuffed into gum boots. She couldn't go outdoors in overalls, so she pulled a wash dress on over that, and her apron over that. Crowning it all was her gardening hat. She'd anchored it with a veil to keep the mosquitoes away and tied it under her chins. She looked like a moving mountain. Mary Alice couldn't believe the overalls. "Keeps off the chiggers," Grandma explained. "We're going fishing." I looked around for the rods and reels and at least some bamboo poles, but didn't see any. "Oh, it's just one thing after another in town," Grandma declared. "We wasn't over Decoration Day before it was the 4th of July. Then came the old settlers' picnic. You can't hardly get down the street for the crowds, and the dust never settles. I need me a day off and some peace and quiet." Fresh from the Chicago Loop, Mary Alice and I traded glances. We didn't linger over breakfast because of the smell. The cheese was on the back porch now in a gunny sack. It began to dawn on me that it was the kind of cheese catfish considered a delicacy. Grandma was ready to go, and when she was ready, you'd better be. "Let's get on the road," she said, taking a last look around the kitchen. "Douse the fire and hide the axe and skillet." We blinked. "Oh, it's just a saying," Grandma said, "a country saying. I was a country girl, you know." She carried the gunny sack of cheese herself, tied to the end of a tree limb hitched up on her shoulder. I was in charge of the picnic hamper, and it took all I had to lift it. I looked inside. Half the hamper was home canned fruit, tomatoes and pickled peaches. The other half was vegetables from the garden, snap beans, 4 turnips, a cabbage. The only thing that looked like a picnic was a loaf of unsliced home-baked bread. But I didn't ask. Grandma saved herself a lot of bother by not being the kind of person you question. We trooped out into the morning behind her. As soon as we left her yard, we were in the country, but I had the feeling it could be a long trip. The hamper weighed a ton, and I had no luck in getting Mary Alice to carry the other handle. We were well covered against chiggers, and the day was already hot. Mary Alice preferred skirts, but she had on her play suit with long pants. Being 11, I was too old for shorts anyway, so I had on my jeans. We marched behind Grandma, and it wasn't too bad until the sun came up over the tassels on the corn. We ate the dust of the road for a mile or so. Of course, being a city boy, I didn't know what a mile was, but it felt like a mile. As a stand of timber, we veered across a pasture. "Watch your step," Grandma said. "Cow pies aplenty." You know what cow pies are, right? I hope you never step on one. We were making for Salt Creek, and pretty soon the trees along the creek began to show on the horizon, but they were like a mirage that keeps its distance. Finally, we came to a barbed wire fence with a sign on it. "No trespassing whatsoever. No fishing, nothing. Private property of Piatt County Rod and Gun Club. Signed, Q.B. Dickerson, Sheriff." What do you think Grandma's going to do? Where she wants to go? There's a sign that says no trespassing, and it was posted by the sheriff. "Lift that wire so I can skin under," Grandma said. The lowest wire was pretty close to the ground, but Grandma was already flat on her back in the weeds. She'd pushed the cheese through. Now she began to work her shoulders, to inch herself under. I pulled up on the wire to the best of my ability. There wasn't much slack in it. The barbs snagged her hat, though they cleared her nose. But now here came her bosom. Mary Alice stood by, sucking in her own small chest, hoping to help. The wire cut my hand. I was stabbed 3 times by the barbs. But like a miracle, Grandma shimmied under Mary Alice, followed with plenty of room, though she didn't like to get burrs in her hair. Being a boy, I climbed the wires and pivoted over on the fence post on the heel of my wounded hand. I dragged the hamper through, and now we were in forbidden territory. It all looked overgrown and deserted to me, but Grandma, speaking low, said, "Hush up from here on and just keep behind me." We were in trees and tall grass. As we sloped to the creek bottom, the ground grew soggy underfoot. Dragonflies skated over the scum on the stagnant backwater. Grandma made her way along the willows, weeping into the water. When she pulled back a tangle of vines, we saw an old, worn-out, snub-nosed rowboat. It was pulled up and tied to a tree, and the oars were shipped in the wet bottom, beside a long pole with a steel hook at the end. "Work that rope loose," Grandma whispered to me. She pointed for Mary Alice to climb aboard, and she followed, reaching back to me for the hamper. The knot was easy, but pushing the boat out with Grandma in it wasn't. By the time the boat was afloat, I was up to my shoe tops in muddy water. I never thought for a minute that this was Grandma's boat. But she was one expert rower. We had the oars and the locks, and they pulled the water with hardly a ripple. She turned us and rowed along the bank under the low-hanging limbs. We were on our way somewhere, quiet as the morning. I was in the back of the boat, lolling, my mind drifting. Then I got the scare of my life. A low limb writhed and looped. I caught a quick glimpse of sliding scales and an evil eye, maybe a fang. Then an enormous snake dropped into the boat. It just missed Grandma's lap and fell hissing between her and me. The last thing I saw was this thing, thick as a tire, snapping into a coil. When I came to, we were tied up to a sapling, and Grandma was crouched over me. She was applying a rag wet with creek water to my forehead. Mary Alice was behind her, looking round-eyed at me. "You fainted, Joey," she accused. "Oh, boys don't faint. I passed out, and it was probably mostly from the heat. Sunstroke, baby." Then I remembered the snake and grabbed at my knees. "Never mind," Grandma said. "It's gone. It was harmless. Good-sized, but harmless. There's cottonmouths around, though, so I'd keep my hands in the boat if I was you." "It was swell," Mary Alice said. "It was keen. You should have seen how Grandma grabbed it by its tail, snapped it just once, broke its neck." It was all neck to me, if you asked. Then she hauled off and flung it way out in the water. Mary Alice went on relentlessly. "Grandma's something with snakes. You should have seen." Okay, I muttered. Grandma stifled a rare smile. I suspected she had no high opinion of the bravery of the male sex, and I hadn't done anything to change her mind. Why wasn't it Mary Alice who'd done the fainting? It bothered me off and on for years. We were underway again, me keeping a sharp eye on low-hanging limbs. I was recovering from everything but embarrassment, and Grandma was rowing out from the bank. Now she was putting up the oars and standing in the boat. It rocked dangerously, though she planted her boots as wide as the sides allowed. She reached down for the long rod with the hook on the end. Glancing briefly into the brown water, she plunged the rod into the creek. It hit something, and she began to pull the rod back up, hand over hand. She was weaving to keep her balance in the tipping boat. I wanted to hang on to the sides, but pictured a cottonmouth rearing up and sinking fangs in my hand. Something broke the surface of the creek. Something on a chain Grandma had hooked. It was bigger than the picnic hamper and looked like an orange crate streaming water. And inside, whipping tails and general writhing. I thought of cottonmouths and ducked, but they were catfish, mad as hornets, who'd been drawn by Grandma's terrible cheese. She heaved in the crate and unlatched the top. In the bottom of the boat was a wire and net contraption that expanded as she filled it with wriggling fish. A catfish is the ugliest thing with gills, and even Mary Alice drew back her feet. Grandma kept at it, bent in the boat. She was as busy as a bird dog, one of her favorite sayings. When all the catfish were in the net, flopping their last in the bottom of the boat, she took the new cheese out of the gunny sack and stuck it in the crate. "Grandma, how did you remember where it was?" I said, amazed. "You couldn't see it, but you snagged it with the hook right off." "Remembered where I sunk it," she said briefly. Now she was lowering the empty crate, baited with cheese, back in the water. Except it wasn't really a crate. It was a fish trap. When we went in Wisconsin to fish, using a fish trap carried a $5 fine. "Grandma," I said, "is trapping fish legal in this state?" "Well, if it was, we wouldn't have to be so quiet." "What's the fine?" "Nothing if you don't get caught," she said. "Anyhow, it's not my boat." Which was an example of the way Grandma reasoned. "Them critters love that cheese," she said fondly as the trap sank from view. She bent over the side to try to wash the smell off her hands, nearly swamping the boat. Soon we were gliding gently downstream, Grandma rowing easy. The catfish were at her feet, flopping less now. My brain buzzed. Dad was a dedicated fisherman. He tied his own flies. He was a member of the Conservation Club. What if he knew his own mother ran illegal fish traps? Brewing home beer was one thing, because the Prohibition law only profited the bootleggers, but we're talking about good sportsmanship here. I noticed Mary Alice's eyes on me. She was watching me around Grandma's rowing arm, and she was reading my mind. It was then we decided never to tell Dad. So how many laws or rules has Grandma broken since we started reading the chapter? Well, first of all, they're trespassing. Second of all, she borrowed someone's boat that didn't belong to her. Third, she has fish traps, which are probably illegal. You could say one thing for Grandma's method. You got all your fishing done at once. It wasn't later than 8 o'clock, and maybe we'd gotten away with it. It seemed to me we ought to have brought some poles along and a can of worms, considering our catch, but I thought maybe things would settle down now and we would have the quiet day in the country Grandma wanted. Then we heard singing. I almost jumped out of the boat. It had felt as if we three were alone in the world. Now this singing warbled up from around a bend in the creek like a bad barbershop quartet, with extra voices chiming in. "Camptown ladies, sing this song, doo-dah, doo-dah." Grandma nudged the boat into the bank just where the creek began to bend. Through the undergrowth we saw a ramshackle building on the far bank. Above the porch was a sign, a plank with words burned in, Rod and Gun Club. A row of empty whiskey bottles stood on the porch rail, and behind them came the singing. "Bet my money on the bobtail nag, somebody bet on the hay." The porch sagged with singers, grown men in their underwear, still partying from last night. Old guys in really droopy underwear. It was a grisly sight, and Mary Alice's eyes bugged. I wasn't sure she ought to be seeing this. They were waving bottles and trying to dance. I didn't know what they'd do next. Grandma was fascinated. As we watched, a skinny old guy with a deputy's badge pinned to his long john stepped forth and was real sick over the rail into the water. "Earl T. Askew," Grandma muttered, "president of the Chamber of Commerce." But now a fat old geezer in the droopiest drawers and nothing else pulled himself up on the porch rail. Bottles toppled into the water as he stood barefoot on the rail, teetering back and forth, then forward, while the others behind him roared, "Whoa! Whoa!" "Shut up a minute," he roared back at them, "and I'll sing you a good song." He took a slug out of the bottle in his fist, and he began, "The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget. The whole darn town got stinkin' drunk, and some ain't sober yet. The only thing that done that night that filled my heart with fear, they took the ice right off the corpse and put it in the beer. Then he fell back with the arms of the cheering crowd. Ain't that disgusting, Grandma said. He couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Who is he? I whispered. O.B. Dickerson, the sheriff, she said. And them drunk skunks with him is the entire business community of the town. Mary Alice gasped. The drawers on some of the business community were riding mighty low. They are not acting right, she said very prim. Men in a bunch never do, Grandma said. They were tight enough to fight, too, and we were on their private property. Not only that, we were in a boat full of trapped fish, almost under the bloodshot eye of the sheriff. I thought it was time to head upstream as fast as Grandma could row. But no. She jammed an oar into the bank to push us off. Then she began rowing around the bend. My heart stopped. The full chorus was singing again, louder as we got nearer. Sweet Adeline, old pal of mine. The Rod and Gun Club came into view, and so did we. Mary Alice was perched in the bow. Grandma was rowing steady, and I was in the stern, wondering if the fish showed. It took the drunks on the porch a moment to focus on us. We were sailing right past them now, smooth as silk, big as life. You're the flower of my heart, sweet Ad. They saw us, and Grandma saw them, as if for the first time. She seemed to lose control of the oars, and her mouth fell open in shock. Mary Alice was already shocked and didn't have to pretend. I didn't know where to look. Some of the business community were so far gone they just stared back, unbelieving. They thought they owned that stretch of the creek. A few, seeing that Grandma and Mary Alice were the opposite sex, scrambled to hide themselves behind the others. But you never saw anybody looking as scandalized as Grandma was at these old birds in their union suits and less. She was speechless as her gaze passed over them all, recognizing everybody. It was a silent scene until Sheriff O.B. Dickerson found his voice. Stop! In the name of the law, he bellowed. That's my boat! Okay, so now the prediction that we had was who was the one-woman crime scene, and I think we can agree it's probably Grandma. What do you think of Grandma? Do you think she's really a bad person? Or do you think she's doing all of this for a good reason? Well, we won't know until we finish the chapter. But that's all for today. We'll finish the chapter later. Bye-bye.